The palace had always felt safe, until George saw what no one else dared to notice. That one glance changed everything. For Prince George, the grand halls of the palace had always meant comfort steeped in tradition, duty, and love. As the future king, he grew up believing those walls protected the people he loved most. But that belief shattered on a single, chilling afternoon when his eyes caught what no one else seemed to notice. Camilla stood just a few feet away, her smile fixed, her hands softly resting on her own grandchildren's shoulders, guiding them into the center of the room. Charlotte lingered quietly to the side, her little fingers clutching the edge of her dress. At first, George thought nothing of it, perhaps a simple oversight. But then it happened again. Camilla leaned down to whisper something sweet to her grandson, her gaze skimming past Charlotte, as though she weren't there at all. George's heart thudded harder. He watched more closely. It became undeniable. Camilla was carefully, almost artfully, placing her grandchildren front and center, while Charlotte was gently but consistently edged out of sight. Behind the staged royal smiles and rehearsed elegance, a quiet betrayal unfolded right before his eyes. And though no one else seemed to notice the tension swirling beneath the surface, George's stomach sank with the weight of realization. His sister, his own sister, was being deliberately pushed aside. The realization struck deeper as the minutes ticked on. Every word, every gesture, every carefully arranged photograph felt poisoned by the truth he was now seeing. He saw Charlotte glance toward him once, just once, her lips pressed tight, her posture slightly slumped. In that fleeting second, he understood it all. Behind the regal image, behind the family they were all supposed to trust, there was something far darker at play. Tears pricked his eyes, not just of sadness but of something heavier, a mix of hurt, anger, and the raw understanding of betrayal. And though the palace was full of watchful eyes and unyielding rules, George felt a spark inside him that refused to be silenced. That was the moment the future king was born, not the one who would inherit the crown, but the one who would fight for what was right. He clenched his small fists and stood just a little closer to Charlotte, as if his mere presence could shield her from what was coming. In that instant, George made himself a quiet vow, born not of ceremony or obligation, but of love and defiance. He would shield his sister at all costs. Whatever trap was being laid before her, he would stand between her and the danger. The boy inside him gave way to something much stronger, a protector. He would not let Charlotte be sacrificed to the quiet ambitions of others, no matter what it took. But George wasn't the only one who noticed. A much smaller voice soon spoke the truth no one dared to say. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the heaviest truths. And Louis spoke what everyone else feared to say. In a moment that was supposed to be light-hearted, a cheerful, behind-the-scenes glimpse of royal life, Prince Louis, barely old enough to understand the weight of his words, uttered something that shook the palace to its core. The cameras were rolling, the crew chatting casually as they set up the next shot inside Kensington Palace. A producer, attempting to draw out a sweet soundbite, crouched down and asked, "What do you love most about your sister?" It was a simple question, meant to melt hearts. But Louis did not smile. He did not hesitate. His wide eyes met the camera as he quietly replied, "Granny Camilla made her cry." For a few seconds, no one moved. The room froze in stunned silence, as if his words had sucked the air out of the space. A crew member dropped his clipboard. A director's pen slipped through his fingers and clattered to the ground. Someone in the corner mouthed something they dared not say aloud. Did he just say that? But Louis, in his innocence, seemed entirely unbothered by the reaction. To him, it was merely a fact, one he had carried with him, unspoken, until now. That single line, soft, pure, unfiltered, did more damage to the royal image than any tabloid headline ever could. Behind the carefully curated smiles and pristine family portraits lay a truth the palace had worked tirelessly to conceal. Camilla, the queen consort who had spent years rebuilding her public persona as a loving maternal figure, was now painted in a much darker light. Her grandmotherly charm cracked in an instant, revealing something harsher beneath. The whispers started immediately, first among the crew, then spilling out into the corridors of the palace. Could the footage be cut? Could it be buried? But no matter how many advisors scrambled, or how many press officers begged, the truth was already alive in the minds of those who heard it. Even if the clip never aired, its existence could not be erased. The damage was already done, and the facade was splintering under the weight of one child's honesty. Louis's innocent candor forced the family to confront what they'd tried so hard to ignore. No longer could they pretend that everything was fine behind closed doors, that Charlotte's tears were fleeting or insignificant. The smallest member of the family had become its loudest truth-teller, and his words reverberated through the palace like an earthquake. The walls that had once shielded secrets now seemed paper-thin. And this wasn't a one-time slip. The cracks in Camilla's image were just beginning to show. It was supposed to be a perfect portrait, until Charlotte's tears stained the memory forever. The royal family had gathered under the grand pretense of unity, summoned for a portrait that was meant to symbolize harmony. Photographers positioned their lenses, stylists fussed over every detail, and aides moved with rehearsed precision. To the outside world, it was just another staged moment of royal grace, a perfect picture to seal into history. But within those gilded walls, the carefully constructed image began to crack. Charlotte, standing small in her pristine dress, fidgeted. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, tugged at her sleeve, glanced toward her mother. At first, it was nothing more than the restless energy of a child forced into stillness for too long, but in the charged silence of the room, even her smallest movements seemed magnified. Camilla's gaze fixed on her. At first, the expression was hard to read, perhaps impatience, perhaps disapproval. Then, without warning, her voice cut through the air like a blade. "Stop acting spoiled," she hissed, her words sharp and deliberate. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the photographers froze, their cameras momentarily forgotten. Aides avoided eye contact, their hands suddenly busy with imaginary tasks. And in the center of it all, Charlotte's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes, her composure shattering, as she turned and fled straight into Kate's waiting arms. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The tension, once buried beneath royal etiquette, became impossible to ignore. Kate clutched her daughter protectively, her own jaw tight, her shoulders stiff. William's eyes darkened as he stood a little straighter, his expression unreadable but undeniably cold. Laughter and polite chatter returned eventually. The photographers resumed their work, and Camilla plastered on her familiar smile. But the damage had been done. Behind the rehearsed pleasantries, a line had been crossed that no one could unsee. For the rest of the session, Charlotte stayed close to her mother, her eyes downcast, her hands clenching her dress. That night, when the lights dimmed and the cameras were packed away, the memory of her tears lingered like an open wound. To the outside world, the photograph would appear flawless, but within the walls of the palace, the truth would haunt them. It wasn't just Charlotte's pain that changed everything, it was what awakened her parents. That single moment sparked a quiet, fierce resolve in Kate and William. No longer would they allow anyone, not even a queen consort, to treat their daughter with such disregard. Something inside both of them hardened that day. They realized that protection was no longer optional. It was a necessity. From that day forward, boundaries began forming quietly but unbreakable. For William and Kate, this wasn't politics. This was war, quiet, determined, and for their children. When William heard what had transpired during the portrait session, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence carried a weight far heavier than fury. Beneath the composed exterior, there was no mistaking the quiet rage that coursed through him. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardened, and though his words were few, their meaning was impossible to miss. For him, this was no longer a matter of royal decorum or family politics. It was something far more primal, the instinct to defend his children, no matter who stood in the way. Kate, meanwhile, appeared pale and shaken when she recounted the details to him. The memory of Charlotte running into her arms, tears streaking down her cheeks, had left her rattled in a way that few things ever had. Her voice, though soft, carried a steel edge when she made her position clear. Camilla would never, under any circumstance, be left alone with the children again. The words hung between them as an unspoken pact, a line neither of them would ever allow to be crossed. From that moment on, new rules were quietly, but unmistakably, set in motion. There were no memos, no announcements, no outward signs that anything had changed, but behind the scenes, everything had. Every event, every appearance, every visit was now meticulously managed to ensure that a trusted adult, whether Kate, William, or a deeply vetted nanny, was always within arm's reach. Camilla's interactions with George, Charlotte, and Louis were no longer casual or spontaneous. They were controlled, monitored, and at times, painfully formal. Palace staff noticed the shift almost immediately. Whispers passed among the corridors that something had broken beneath the surface. A long-serving nanny quietly confirmed to a close friend that Camilla was never again alone with the whale's children, not even for a minute. The quiet unease that had once settled only over Kate and William began to ripple outward, touching every corner of the household. Smiles in public still appeared as bright as ever, the family posed together for cameras, and the world continued to believe in the illusion of harmony. But those who moved within the palace walls could feel the frost that had set in behind closed doors. With every carefully managed interaction, with every protective glance and strategic barrier, the family's message became unmistakably clear. Nothing, and no one, would ever again come between them and their children. The crown, the image, the traditions, all of it paled next to the duty they now felt most keenly. Protect the children, at any cost. And yet, even as these new safeguards surrounded Charlotte, there was one thing they could not shield her from: the memories that had already taken root. Memories that lingered silently, haunting her in ways no boundary could erase. But even with safeguards, Charlotte's memories stayed alive and painfully silent. Sometimes, the loudest truths are spoken in silence, and Charlotte's silence was deafening. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte changed. The bright little girl who once bounded into rooms with unguarded smiles now moved like a shadow of herself, quiet and deliberate, her small frame stiff whenever Camilla entered the room. At public events, she stood slightly behind Kate or William, her fingers curling into her dress, her eyes fixed on the ground. And though she never said a word, her silence screamed. It was in the way she avoided Camilla's gaze entirely, in the way she pressed closer to her mother whenever Camilla drew near, as though her own body remembered what her lips refused to utter. That silence, heavy and unrelenting, became the cruelest evidence of all the wound that could not heal, because it was never allowed to be acknowledged. Louis, still too young to understand the weight of his own honesty, spoke again when no one expected it. During another cheerful moment at a family gathering, he blurted out another observation about Camilla, a quiet indictment of what everyone already knew but no one dared voice outright. And Charlotte, standing right beside him, didn't flinch, didn't correct him, didn't even glance at him. She simply remained still, her silence confirming everything without so much as a syllable. That unspoken acknowledgement cut through the illusions faster than any confrontation could have. William and Kate, always watchful now, made their protective gestures so natural that the public never saw them. A gentle hand on Charlotte's shoulder, William subtly stepped between her and Camilla in crowded rooms. Kate leaned in closer during conversations, so her daughter never had to look anywhere else. At every event, at every dinner, at every portrait, those small, quiet shields were raised over and over, unnoticed by the world but felt deeply by the little girl who depended on them. One night, when the cameras were gone and the palace corridors had quieted, Kate sat beside William and whispered what she had been carrying all along. "She remembers," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "She always remembers." And it was true. Children remember more than adults care to admit: the tone, the glances, the way someone can make them feel smaller without raising a hand. And Charlotte remembered everything. From then on, the family began shaping their appearances differently, not for the sake of public expectation, but for Charlotte's comfort. Fewer interactions, more space, a schedule that quietly kept Camilla at arm's length without needing to announce it. Even the smallest details were adjusted: where Charlotte stood during photographs, where she sat at dinner tables, all of it to create an invisible circle of safety around her. And within that silence, Charlotte's presence spoke volumes, her quiet defiance standing as a living testament to what she had endured and what her parents refused to let happen again. The more they watched their children, the clearer their choice became, and Diana's legacy grew stronger. Even decades after her death, Diana still raises her grandchildren through her son's heart. For William, his mother was never just a memory confined to faded photographs and whispered stories. Diana was a presence alive in his choices, his instincts, his quiet determination to raise his children differently than he had been raised. Her warmth, her willingness to kneel to a child's eye level, her fearlessness in showing love even under the harshest scrutiny, all of it became his compass when navigating fatherhood. It wasn't just about protecting George, Charlotte, and Louis from the outside world. It was about shielding them from the icy detachment he himself had endured in those same gilded halls. The contrast between what Diana gave him and what Camilla brought into the palace was impossible to ignore. Where Diana had been soft, open, and human, Camilla remained firm, restrained, and at times cold. believing that children needed discipline more than comfort, control more than kindness. That stark difference lit a fire in William. He made a silent vow early in his marriage that the emotional neglect he had felt would not repeat itself in his children's lives. Every time he saw Charlotte's shoulders tense or Louis's wide eyes darken with confusion, he was reminded of the loneliness he once felt. But unlike his own childhood, his response was immediate, stepping closer, speaking gently, giving them the affection they needed instead of retreating into silence. He carried Diana's lessons not as burdens but as gifts, handed down through pain but transformed into strength. At night, as the children huddled around him and Kate, Diana's name often surfaced not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a hero they could understand. Bedtime stories weren't just fairy tales. They were stories of courage and love drawn from their grandmother's life. George learned about her kindness toward strangers, Charlotte about her quiet bravery in defying expectations, and Louis about her limitless empathy for those overlooked. Each story left a mark, shaping the way they saw the world and themselves. Kate, too, carried Diana's spirit forward, though she had never met her. She embodied that same quiet grace, filling the gaps left by the cold traditions of the palace with nurturing presence and patience. Where others demanded perfection, Kate offered understanding. Where the crown imposed distance, she offered touch. Together, William and Kate made it clear their family would not be ruled by fear of the public's gaze, but by love for one another, even if that choice defied palace norms and drew quiet disapproval from behind closed doors. They chose tenderness over tradition, humanity over hierarchy, and in doing so, they carried Diana's legacy forward, not in grand statements or defiant speeches, but in the quiet, everyday choices that ensured their children would never feel alone in the way William once had. But while William embraced love, Camilla clung to control, and her perspective revealed her pain. For Camilla, every smile from the children felt rehearsed, and every distance felt deliberate. In the quiet moments that followed the storm, Camilla began to feel the chill settle in. Each time she stepped into a room and saw the children instinctively press closer to their parents, she wondered if their smiles were genuine or simply learned. What once felt like awkwardness now felt like rejection, and what once seemed like shyness now stung like disdain. She couldn't shake the sense that no matter how hard she tried, she was miscast and painted as a villain in a story she hadn't meant to write. She had believed that setting boundaries was love, that discipline was a gift no one else had the courage to give. But each day, it seemed clearer that her firmness was being misunderstood as cruelty, and that no amount of explanation could soften how they looked at her. Behind closed doors, she confided her doubts in whispers to trusted friends, her voice breaking with words she never imagined she'd say. "Maybe I'll always be seen as the one who came after," she admitted, a painful truth that clung to her like a shadow. The realization cut deeper than she expected, that even as queen consort, she felt like little more than an outsider. Even Charles, once her closest ally, seemed increasingly distant, his attention drawn to his grandchildren, his warmth dulled by the unspoken tension that now ran through the palace. And though he never said it aloud, she could feel his eyes on her during those strained gatherings, as if silently asking whether she was to blame for the frost now thickening between them all. Camilla struggled to reconcile her own upbringing with the stern discipline she had once endured and come to respect with the warmth now expected of her. It baffled her that the same firmness she believed had shaped her into someone strong was now perceived as harshness, as something to shield the children from. At times, she wondered if there was no place for her here at all, if this family, this generation, was built on a kind of softness she simply couldn't understand. As weeks turned to months, her fear only deepened. The more she tried to reach them, the further they seemed to drift. The more she smiled, the colder their silence felt. And in her quietest moments, when the palace walls no longer demanded perfection, she admitted to herself what she could not say to anyone else. She feared she would never truly belong to this version of the monarchy. That no matter how many titles she wore or duties she performed, she would remain an intruder in a house haunted by someone else's memory. And as Camilla wrestled with loneliness, Charles stood helplessly torn between the two women who shaped his life. King Charles stood between his past and his future, and neither side would let go. In the suffocating quiet of the palace, Charles could feel the ground shifting beneath him. What had begun as a subtle unease had grown into a fault line that split the family in two, and no amount of composure could disguise it anymore. He watched closely, taking note of every glance between William and Camilla, every quiet retreat Charlotte made to her mother's side, every stiff smile painted on for the cameras. The emotional chasm was no longer something he could ignore. It was widening before his very eyes. He had once believed that his role was to hold everyone together, to keep the traditions intact, while fostering some illusion of harmony. But now he saw how futile that had become. Charles tried to keep up appearances, of course. At family events, he stood tall, his expression steady, his words measured, but behind his calm facade, he felt the weight of it all pressing down. The smiles in public felt like lies, and the polite exchanges carried a bitterness he could not dispel. Even the smallest ceremonies left him visibly fatigued, his energy drained not just by the relentless obligations of the crown, but by the silent battle playing out around him. The strain showed in his posture, in the way his hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was watching, in the long silences that followed him back to his private quarters. In private meetings with William, Charles found himself disarmed. His son, though respectful, was unyielding. William spoke quietly, but with unmistakable certainty. The children came first. Not the image of the monarchy, not the pageantry, just the children. At first, Charles tried to argue, to frame it as a misunderstanding, to suggest that time would heal the rift. But William's response left no room for doubt. This wasn't rebellion. It was a redefinition. A deliberate, necessary shift in priorities, even if it clashed with the traditions Charles had spent his life defending. For the first time, Charles began to understand what was truly at stake. This was not just about family politics or bruised egos. It was about the future of the monarchy itself. Whether he admitted it or not, the choice was already being made for him. The quiet, protective love William showed his children was rewriting the rules, and Charles realized he had to decide whether he would stand in the way of that evolution or step aside and let it unfold. And so, he watched, torn and weary, caught between loyalty to the woman who stood beside him through scandal and the son who embodied the crown's future. The realization settled over him with both clarity and dread. The traditions he thought would outlast him were now in question, and no amount of resistance could stop what was coming. When the world found out, the palace curtain finally dropped, and the storm outside began. One child's words started a storm, and the monarchy would never look the same again. It began with a sentence so small it could have been dismissed as childish mischief. But Louis's words, raw and unfiltered, broke through the palace walls and spilled into the world outside, igniting a blaze the crown could not contain. As whispers turned to headlines, clips of his quiet confession swept across screens and timelines, sparking outrage, heartbreak, and something the monarchy had long feared scrutiny they could no longer deflect. Within hours, "Protect Charlotte" was trending worldwide, not just as a slogan but as a rallying cry. Commentators debated furiously on morning shows. Pundits dissected every image and gesture from past events, and the public, by an overwhelming margin, declared their allegiance to William and Kate. To them, it was simple. The children deserved better, and their parents were the only ones brave enough to deliver it. In the firestorm that followed, the narrative hardened into something even more damning. Diana's memory was resurrected in sharp contrast to Camilla's image, her warmth versus Camilla's coldness, her embrace versus Camilla's reprimand. Everywhere people looked, they saw the same story play out. The woman who had loved openly against the one who was disciplined from a distance. It wasn't just about a single tear or a fleeting insult anymore, it was about legacy. About which of these two women would define the future of the monarchy through the next generation. Behind the scenes, the palace scrambled to adjust, but the changes came quietly, without fanfare. Internal protocols shifted overnight. Camilla's role became more ceremonial than personal, and her access to the children was pared down to formal appearances only. These adjustments, though never publicly announced, were undeniable to those paying attention. Camilla, who had once stood closer to the center, now stood at the edges, her influence quietly receding into the shadows. And in her place rose William and Kate, the Wales family, no longer simply heirs but symbols of a monarchy willing to break its own rules for the sake of its youngest members. Their choices resonated far beyond palace gates, offering a vision of royalty not as an unfeeling institution but as a family willing to bleed and bend for love. They embodied something new, a modern, emotional monarchy that dared to prioritize authenticity over appearance, vulnerability over control. The palace itself now stands at a crossroads, caught between the cold formality of its history and the emotional authenticity demanded by its future. The question remains whether the crown can survive the storm and still honor the humanity it so often hides. But one thing has become undeniable. The monarchy has already been changed forever, not by decree or tradition, but by the smallest voice telling the hardest truth, because behind every crown lies a human heart. And this story proved that even royalty cannot escape love, hurt, and the unbreakable bond of family. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.